welcome to Vulgar Blog. And today we have Malu Castro returning to talk about climate change, environmental pricing schemes, cultural appropriation pricing schemes, relationality, and also the limits of at least the first half of that sentence. So that's a lot. By the time I name this, it'll have a more concise name than that. But one of the things that's come up a lot lately, I was actually talking to you in a separate context about attempts to price for cultural appropriation and how like I considered it like both kind of a completely rational response by elements of the indigenous community to property law, but also a rational response that conceded the validity of intellectual property law in a way that was like going to actually ultimately be problematic. And then you brought up that was actually very similar to climate pricing and the concessions there. So let's talk about climate pricing and the way indigenous groups have tried to intervene in that. So what is the model for climate pricing right now?
What's the model on it?
Yeah, for climate pricing, carbon pricing, etc. Like, how are people what are people trying to do with this concept?
Got it. So before we get started, I'll kind of give some kind of context. I appreciated your points about hermeneutics and kind of some of the eco-socialist takes recently. So for the audience, I think I kind of understand like where and how I read this research and kind of how I approach this literature. Yeah, I'm a graduate student kind of studying this at the doctoral level. I have kind of scholarly interests that kind of bring me into line with like policy conditions and questions around this nationally and internationally. But a lot of this actually kind of is like very practical to me, right? Because currently, like in the very near term, right, I might be serving or kind of operating as a consultant or on a board member for this land trust in Hawaii, right, where we might be receiving 56,000 acres, right? And in the near term, I have to really kind of be thinking through like what are the different financing schemes that I can leverage to kind of, make that property ownership happen. We can talk about that and kind of how that shapes my reading and kind of thinking about this literature. But when we're talking about like climate pricing or environmental pricing, I think that there's like a few kind of like main pillars I wanted to hit today. Right. So like, I think first there's a kind of a component around this around like land claims and like title and property, right? A lot of kind of I don't say like any, but most attempts at pricing or financing kind of climate or environmental activity, right? Reforestation, resistance to degradation often requires some sort of title or property right. And then in the center of that, right, and kind of next to that is like, well, how are we kind of getting to these values, right? So recently in 2021, I believe, the UN finally standardized its system for environmental economics accounting and ecosystem accounting, right? So that was their attempt at kind of taking this longer and kind of older history of accounting for ecosystem services, different kind of one-off national and even international programs are paying for ecosystem services, things like even like fallowing land post Dust Bowl and stuff like that, taking these and trying to make a standardized approach to this that was in line with the systems for national accounting, right? So we recently just had this kind of like internationally standardized approach in 2021, which is also connected to this thing called TEEB, which is the economics of the environment and biodiversity, right? So if you want to look that up, you definitely should. They kind of give a guide on basically the value, right? And how to transfer the value of these different ecosystem services. And then the kind of other specter in this room is the carbon market, right? And like, I don't think we can kind of talk about pricing of environmental goods or services, climate goods and services without talking about carbon offsets, carbon abatements, carbon credits, whatever you want to call it, like allowances, depending on which system that you're using. And how that's still, regardless of the kind of massive amount of research and reporting kind of into the real limitations, and if not kind of corruption or kind of just negligence within that kind of current system, is still one of the major kind of paths forward. So right now, again, like there's not any kind of international, like multilateral or even kind of like bilateral system for kind of trading credits. So when we're talking about how communities are facing, like my own community, facing the question of price, it really depends on the context of, are we interacting with the state? Are we interacting with the federal government? Are we interacting with a voluntary carbon market? Right? Something like Vera, which is like one of the big nonprofits that kind of manages the big BCMs out there. And yeah, so there's a lot there. So there's like kind of this big kind of, kind of convergence of a lot of different systems, like rights, property claims, what are the valuation of ecosystem services, and then obviously the question of like carbon credits. And we can kind of get into kind of some of the big issues I see with that for Indigenous peoples in particular. But I think that they actually, before we kind of get into that, I kind of want to say that anything I say that kind of pertains to the issues for Indigenous peoples only probably actually has like a downstream concern for basically anyone, because the approach that the elites, right, be it the state or the market, are approaching the pricing of environmental services or carbon has largely been kind of without the concern of the kind of continuation of like most non-elite communities or groups, right? And I don't mean that's kind of been like negligent science or whatever, right? But I think it's just a fair thing to say, right? That it's not like they went to some kind of conservative community in Georgia and were like, hey, how would you like us to interpret the valuation of your fallowed land or something like that, right? Or of your forests, right? So, yeah, that's the kind of applicability outside, I think, of Indigenous context, right? But yeah, sorry, I don't think I answered the question around it.
No. That's actually that's an important thing to talk about when we talk about Indigenous context. Like, I basically have a framework of like what happens to Indigenous people is somewhat unique to them, but a lot of the stuff that happens to them will then happen to other marginalized people, and then it's going to happen to poor people, and then it's going to happen to lower middle class people, and then it might even happen to middle class people. Like there is a hierarchy of things. Now, there's some things that are unique, like the res system for Indigenous Americans is uniquely shitty, but like, but there's a way in which I've, even from a class perspective, like when you think about like why Black Lives Matter had such purchase before it was recuperated. It very much has purchase because people can kind of see that, like, well, even as a white person, this shit's going to happen to my people eventually, even if you think of this in a my people kind of way. And I think that's an important thing to start off of. And when we talk about the particularities of trying to deal with this environmental fairness pricing schemes, both in carbon and in other kinds of quote environmental justice, you really start seeing that there's a bunch of problems. I mean, the most obvious one to me is like, well, if you can price for it, then you can still do it. But beyond that, I mean, beyond like the most like I'm a freshman in a sociology class answer to this. What are some of the problems? I mean, like, so when we talk about, for example, like pricing for, let's say, fairly compensating for, I don't know, an oil pipeline going through, I don't know, some indigenous lands where the land rights are even kind of still recognized by the federal government. One of the rare times that they did that.
What are the issues?
What are the issues? What issues can pertain to that? I mean, there's obvious ones that we see in the, like, obviously people who can't. I'm alluding to Standing Rock, but there's the unobvious ones too, and I'm kind of interested in both.
Right. So there's a really kind of perfect case of this kind of over the border in Canada. We talked about British Columbia a lot last time where I was on with Glenn Coulthard. If for people who are interested in kind of like the best, I think, kind of financing and kind of critical finance capital kind of research on Indigenous issues or First Nations issues, look up Shiri Pasternak. She's with the Yellowhead Institute, which has done a lot of great work. She put out a paper that I really like, kind of looking at the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, right, which was like this huge expansion through the Indigenous communities. And I'm going to butcher this, but I think it's a Secwempemc. I can't, I apologize.
I can't help you on Indigenous language.
No worries. But it's one of the, and I apologize for them, but it's First Nations there in that community. And And what's really interesting is when that pipeline was facing kind of the tiny house warriors kind of blockades, right? And we can kind of, I think this was, oh God, I can't remember the years, but let's say 2016, 2017, around that time, maybe even a little later. And there was a major hit, and where the actual, I think it was Kinder Morgan was going to pull out. The state of Canada, right? The Trudeau government went in and said, we're going to kind of clear this, right? We're going to take the risk of this non-profitable pipeline. And what's interesting in that case example is within that community, they fall underneath the Aboriginal title that was secured with the Delgamuukw decision in 1997, right? And that decision basically says that when in cases where Aboriginal title has not been clearly extinguished, right, whatever that means, that they actually operate from a perspective that they have territorial land use approaches to sovereignty and kind of ownership, right? And this is really important, right? Because this extended the actual purview of these communities' kind of authority and sovereignty way beyond any kind of personal allotments or like lots that they had, or the different kind of band or kind of sub-national structures that were kind of imposed on them by the Canadian government. So fast forward to the TMPE, one of the approaches that the market, that the Trudeau government kind of imposed on fossil fuel development was saying, hey, you should go and basically try and secure claim settlements to this pipeline development from individual bands, right? Maybe individual property owners within this kind of checkerboard, right? Kind of pushing past, right, this decision in 1997 that said that this community had kind of territorial governance. And the perniciousness there is that the market or the kind of industry approach to this was like, yeah, like let's have a mutual benefit agreement. I'm going to go to this particular band with this confined territory and say, hey, I'm going to give you, X development funds or whatever you wanted to say. Will you sign off on me passing this pipeline through, right? But we understand that any kind of benefit that might come from that independently, right? Even any kind of carbon abatement that might come from that they might have invested in independently in that territory is part of a larger ecosystem, right? That if a pipeline bursts downstream or even a kind of like in the band over, right, that agreement doesn't really mean much of anything, right? That the benefits that they receive from that don't mean much of anything. And that was kind of the take that the community was taking with the tiny house warriors and people like Arthur Manuel. We're saying like, no, you actually have to negotiate with all of us. And we have a right to basically say no to this, right? And that we actually have a right to the entire territory. And I think for people who are like non-Indigenous, when they're thinking about this, right there, what does it mean when the kind of uncertainty of carbon development is something that can be passed on to private contracts, right? Where your neighbor might be someone who can like take on the contract. But then if you say no, what does that even matter, right? Like that, and that they're taking on of that contract gives the kind of industry leverage to kind of say, I'm going to push this through, right? So there's two things there that I think people should take away from is that, I mean, there's nothing stopping eminent domain from happening, right, for any of these either fossil fuel developments or clean energy developments. So the state is more than happy to take on the risk of kind of kicking you off land, right? That's a kind of a common thing. And then when it comes to the kind of uncertainty of either private owners' claims or Indigenous rights claims to these properties, the market is responding and it's trying to develop pretty savvy ways of kind of buying you out of your rights. And I think people need to be really careful with that. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but I think that that's a kind of a basic one of like what other people might be like, what other communities might expect, right? And we kind of saw that with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Where I can imagine that different kind of individual kind of like mutual benefit agreements were received. Yeah, sorry.
No, one, there's a relationality implied in this, that the approach even of a collective atomized subject. So we're not talking about necessarily an individual person, but let's just say like the formal representative of a tribe, or a formal representative of any kind of locality even. that they negotiate this for the mutual benefit, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But there's knock-on effects downstream that will affect them. That's not going to be that externality even in a neoclassical sense will in no place be priced, right? Which is a problem right now. Like carbon offsets and carbon pricing basically exist off of people ignoring that in the exchanges there's probably externalities that are missed in the accounting, no matter what. And that also, you know, we clearly saw this, for example, with the green transition in Europe, where a lot of it was just like we're hiding our carbon use by having the carbon output happen in Russia before sanctions made that impossible to do.
International leakage is insane.
Right. Yeah. And so, go ahead.
No. Sorry. I mean, I think to your question there's like a few concepts that people should kind of understand when they're kind of thinking about like how something like Vera, which is again this like nonprofit that kind of manages the voluntary carbon standard program, which is like the biggest kind of VC voluntary carbon market program out there. I think they traded like 446 million credits. I think I want to say in like 2022 or maybe 2019. I just read a report on that. People should look at the reports kind of coming out that are pretty damning about the kind of verification and validation of those credits and the types of methodologies that they allow the different projects to implement in their particular Red Cross programming, right? So when I say methodologies, it's the kind of methodologies of pricing, and then also the kind of estimation of carbon like assessment, right? And I think the two things that you brought up there, right? So there's one thing called like leakage, right? Which is like, are the activities that is there downstream or like by the kind of project implementation, will there be actually kind of carbon use or kind of carbon emission downstream from that in ways that actually kind of nullify the previous offset, right? So there's market downstream like kind of leakage, and then there's like activity leakage, right? So like let's say I am protecting a forest from illegal loggers. If those illegal loggers go down the road and they start illegally logging another forest, that's activity leakage, right? Market leakage is to that point right now where they're like, hey, like actually internationally, you know, whatever this kind of carbon project did results in kind of increased carbon production somewhere else, or I'm actually just changing my supply chain to do that somewhere else. You know, that's the same thing. And when they looked at the reporting from this program, right, the Vera, I mean, the underestimation of leakage and then basically the non-reporting of international leakage was pretty astounding. That like, oh, it was just not something that happened. And then and then there's like a concept of permanence, right? Which is like how stable, and again, this is slightly different than kind of a mutual benefit agreement, but like let's just say mutual benefit agreement includes some sort of kind of carbon offset component, which is the kind of permanence of that activity to that reduction or that kind of abatement into the future, right? Like how, and that's a kind of a tricky thing with carbon credits is like, you wouldn't want to invest in a carbon credit that's into a project where you think that this forest is going to be there regardless. That actually doesn't, if you're going to protect a forest that's not going to be torn down, that's not really having an offset. But they also don't necessarily want to identify really high risk, in the question of permanence, carbon credit assets, right? And yeah, so I think that there's a kind of 2 points there, right? So leakage, like literally like leakage from a pipeline could be considered part of that, right? And then kind of the question of permanence, which is like how long is like the offsetting component actually persisting? One second, I have to say good night to my kid.
No problem.
A few of the kind of metrics that I think are important to understand, like why there's like all of this recent criticism around something like Vera and their Red Cross Plus program.
So in our discussions about this, we also discussed about something that I don't want to say is unique to the Indigenous in the United States, but it like liberal modalities do not recognize it, which is what we might call relational pricing, or pricing to maintain relationships And by that, I do not just mean with people.
Yeah.
Or I do not just mean with humans. Let me be more specific. People may notice on the show that I'm talking a lot more about like different conceptions of persons, but in the Patreon, I've talked a lot about Marshall Solins' study on personality, relationality, and concepts of what is and is not a person. But that one of the things that some people have tried to do in the Indigenous context is try to price for this.
Yeah.
How has that worked?
So I think there's a few ways that we can kind of understand the kind of question of like Indigenous pricing or valuation, right? One way is, and I want to say something that there's kind of two approaches or kind of traditions of this kind of in this new or kind of novel field of like ecosystem services payment and stuff like that, is that on one hand, I think that there's like a pretty strong question of like, what would Indigenous valuation be, right? How could we understand their ability to kind of set a price? What would they be setting the price on? And then the kind of question of power to kind of impose that price. And there's a lot of kind of interesting questions around that. On the other hand, which I think is more common, both from like an Indigenous perspective, not Indigenous perspective, but in the context of it's actually being applied now, and in some of the academic and gray literature, is like, how do we show the kind of cost savings of basically not having to pay for like Indigenous welfare? That's actually a major approach to this, right? So there's a lot of research kind of coming out around this from the Northern Territory of Australia, where there's a lot of different payment for ecosystem services, management plans around Indigenous protected areas with traditional owners. And some of the reporting I've seen on that is that they're trying to identify they're trying to actually monetize, or at least put a monetary value to some cultural ecosystem services, right, that are kind of actually housed within that larger SEEA framework. And something, again, to keep in mind, right, is that the international standard that I'm bringing up, the SEEA, actually has realms or kind of spaces for valuing cultural services, but they're not monetized. They're just like, look, they're aesthetics, they're beautiful landscapes and stuff like that. So there's been this attempt by researchers and practitioners to say, actually, we can show how that aligns with Indigenous values and worldviews, and we can kind of show how that's monetized. But one of the kind of interesting things there is that, and so I'll run through like a list of some of the issues I've seen, right, is one that the approach to this is like cost savings, right? Is that either by kind of extending or kind of allowing, title claim or kind of supporting title claim, which really doesn't cost the state anything, they can actually say, well, all of these Indigenous youth are out on the country providing fires and burnings, and they're, getting some employment as rangers. We don't have to pay them welfare. Right? That's actually kind of like the kind of interesting kind of pernicious thread there, is like, actually, like, we can actually withhold public funding on that side. And certainly there's something to be said about like Indigenous peoples being out on these landscapes is, healing and recuperative and like meaningful, and it allows them to provision themselves in ways that are maybe commensurate to welfare services. But the approach to this, when I've seen pricing trying to happen, it's especially around the kind of cultural components, right, is around kind of cost savings, travel costs, things that align very well with how to actually save the state money or save an investor money, right? That it's kind of I don't want to say it's an ROI, but it says like, look how much value you're getting above and beyond what you're kind of putting into this. And this isn't kind of getting into the question of like how payment for ecosystem services have really can have really negative effects on communities, right? And I think when people think about like why do Indigenous peoples, roughly like 370 million of them, whatever that means, who occupy X percentage of land, some say 20, some say 40, why are they also in locations where they're kind of conserving or protecting 80% of our biological diversity? And oftentimes it's actually because of the absence or their ability to kind of move away or from the role of pricing in their how they operate their society, right? They may not necessarily rely solely on wage labor as a means of provisioning for their community, right? Even if they do engage in wage labor, it might just be for kind of luxury items or something like that. So we have like this weird tension where we know that Indigenous peoples and how they kind of organize their societies can allow for high levels of biological diversity and high quality, vegetation coverage, all that stuff. But then once these pricing systems come into play, the price, the role of that price coming in really has a destabilizing effect on those, those kind of labor arrangements or that kind of societal arrangements. And there's a lot of research that kind of is pointing to this. Because there's no one going to these communities and saying, hey, I want to pay for your continuation as a society. I want to pay for your ability to kind of continue as a society in the way that you want. And let me help you kind of invest this capital. Let me help you bring this money in ways that aren't going to completely mess up all of your social relationships. It's really kind of up to the community to kind of have that capacity to actually negotiate that question. But, no one's really thinking about like, oh, like when I invest in these communities, like, am I saving money? Or like, they're not investing in like a language program, right? They're not necessarily investing in, these are kind of different cultural programs. And then oftentimes it's, so not only are we not investing in these communities in that way, right? And that's not how these monies are being used. But when monies are present, they're kind of pressured to utilize these funds in particular ways, often in purely kind of conservation ways, right? Like building a hospital may not necessarily be on the plate of ways that those funds could be leveraged. Sorry, again, long response, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's there's a whole lot there to parse out. Yeah. Like one that part of why, like you're right, why do Indigenous communities often, the ones that are allowed to exist, and I laugh because I don't want to cry on that one, are partly allowed to exist because they're in areas where those areas are not highly commodifiable easily, or the cost of commodification is great to the entire planet or whatever. But we're not compensating them for that. And to some degree, like from a capitalist perspective, if you're a liberal, ideal, egalitarian, whatever, good bourgeois, you want to. On the other hand, you don't want to because it's going to cost you money. And you're also admitting in a way that your system is actually dependent on systems that are outside of it and not part of it to maintain, which puts a fundamental tension on the policy in a way that makes it difficult. And when we start, like, the reason why I brought up non-human persons is that pricing for like relations to wildlife becomes really important, and yet part of that's dependent on exactly the relations to wildlife that's hard to commodify.
Yeah.
Right. So asking someone to commodify, like, and I think this is important when I use the relations here as the way of explaining it, because asking someone to commodify your personal relations, which yes, they are in fact partially commodified for you too, but that for most people feels inherently wrong and inherently contradictory. Like those things are not supposed to be in the realm of commodity relations.
Which is an interesting tension in the literature around this, because there's all of this anxiety in the writing on this stuff that I've seen. And the way that it appears is that they're kind of they want to make relational values a value of cultural ecosystem services instead of actually how the valuation occurs, right? That like, what would it mean to like actually have like a relational valuation for our community? And I think that those are very different questions. But the anxiety comes around this question of like, oh, are we basically paying to create a stock of indigenous peoples? And they get really squeamish around this idea of like treating people like an economic asset, which kind of sounds ironic to anyone who kind of studies economics or politics or anything like that. Like that actually isn't that weird or kind of anxiety inducing. But because they understand, and these are from the people who are, I think, are well-meaning, which I think is the scariest part, but also not surprising, is that the people who are well-meaning are like, we know that it's their relational components that allow them to do what we need them to do. But we know that we don't have the power to change any of these other arrangements that are being imposed. So how can we measure this from like almost like a psychological perspective? And they're kind of treating it of like, are people just happy? Like they're having more time with the animals, having more time on the landscape that they have, which, you know, is good, right? That we are kind of allowing for those measures to happen. Maybe, I don't know. But it is like this interesting squeamishness where they're like not willing to take into consideration that basically what they're hoping for is the creation of a stock of indigenous people, right? And not, you know, and what I mean by that, like literally like a stock, like that's kind of how environmental economists approach this stuff is like, can we have a stock of trees, right? You know, that flows to as an environmental service. Now we're kind of talking about people who are providing this service, who aren't even just providing the service, they're actually part of the stock arrangement, right? And yeah, there's a lot of squeamishness and kind of uneasiness with how to kind of what that means for the downstream buyers, basically. And if you ever look up any of this stuff, it's always kind of funny. They're like, there's a mountain and there's like a stream and there's like some like tents or like kind of, you know, like grass huts, and then there's a city. And like that's just kind of how they approach this stuff of like the stock is like up here upstream and it flows downstream to this to the city.
And one thing I like to point out when I think about this as a modality of like capitalist relations between, say, settler to indigenous peoples or elites to non-elites, because I think in this case both models are useful. Again, in the model it settler non-settler, and then model that elites to non-elites, and you'll probably get something like what's going to eventually happen. But that in this you have a whole lot of paradoxes that make people squeamish. No, even the well-meaning people don't like talking about human beings as like animal stock. It's kind of like when people talk about surplus populations, they don't really want, they can talk about it in the abstract, but they don't really want to talk about it directly because that makes everybody uncomfortable and icky. But there's strong implications about, like, as I said, like we need this thing to subsist that we also kind of want to pull into us. But if we pull it into us, it's going to, like, our own contradictions will cause this to become a problem later on. And yet from the indigenous perspective, they're also in and for any non-elite perspective, but again, let's stay with the indigenous here because I do think maybe this clarifies it. Is that on one hand, you want to be open to this because it's a way to continue your way of life in face of an opposed way of life. On the other hand, it also inherently limits you and sets you up to defend something that by its very defense is admitted to be something that won't be around forever, because otherwise they wouldn't be pricing for it.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so there's a short-term interest and a short-term propagation to kind of buy into this methodology. And I like I said to someone, this is the easiest to see and also of the least substantive effect when we talk about like the shift around cultural appropriation talk. Yeah. Like originally it was cultural misappropriation and almost nobody has a problem with that. Then it became cultural appropriation. Why did it become that though? That was actually about property concerns. Yeah. And like people basically not compensating indigenous communities because indigenous creations fell out of this, idea of individual atomized relations. So you couldn't really be copyrighted. So we needed some kind of collective copyright. Yeah. And that makes sense. but in the same way that it also makes it very clear that like, oh, but now you're commodifying these things that were not priorly commodified, and you probably can't do it again. Like, now when you apply that to the environment where it's of much more long-term import, I don't want to say cultural stuff isn't of import, but like,
sure.
But like, no one's really going to stop surviving off of someone not getting paid for an indigenous shirt pattern. Like,
yeah.
Whereas destroying a river, I don't know, say the Amazon, can fuck everything up for everybody. So like,
yeah. So this kind of goes back. So I think so. I have to admit, I haven't like looked to see. I mean, maybe the John Bellamy and Fosters of the world have kind of looked into this or kind of like been perspective of this. But it's kind of interesting. I don't remember kind of leftists really kind of making a lot of like interesting kind of comments around the establishment of like a national natural capital account. Like that's happening in the U.S. is like natural capital accounts are starting to be established. And these are falling in lines again with that ecosystem services account that I was talking about. And nations all over the world are doing this, right? They're kind of actually trying to say like, along with our GDP, we actually want to have alongside that a really rigorous accounting of our natural capital. And we're going to be diverse about it or whatever that means. And the reason why I bring that up is that to your point about the Amazon River, right, is that I think that there's like this kind of interesting kind of like question or kind of concern around like, hey, you don't want to mess up this river. Oftentimes there are people there who are like pretty good at maintaining it, who have like kind of like a vested interest in maintaining it. But if you were to really kind of want to support the maintenance of that river, right? Let's say that also just like the river as its own entity, but also the people that maybe have like a long-standing relationship to that. Do they have property rights to that natural capital account, right? And that's like a really weird question, right? Because you can't, if I was to go to a community and said, let me establish an ecosystems account of all the ecosystem services that you provide, I could describe it in monetary value, but I actually can't use it as money or something, right? Like this, something like that. And that's like the kind of interesting tension there is like someone else can, right? Something else can kind of come in and either through like the financing of services and projects there. But I think that's like why there's like this kind of interesting like kind of problem fields that surrounds trying to account and price for the environment and how people relate to the environment and property rights is that all of a sudden, right, like if you understand that rivers actually provide services, right, like does the health of the river actually have claim to the value that it's provided? And we could kind of get into kind of questions of like things like the Whanganui River out of like New Zealand and other examples of like establishing personhood, like legal personhood for like environmental entities. But I do think that that's kind of fun, like the accounting question of this natural capital or of these ecosystem services fundamentally kind of comes down to an issue of property rights. And again, like when we're thinking about how a lot of ecosystem services are priced and then paid, they're often done through titling. Right. Mm-hmm. So you have to have a clear determination of property, which for a lot of indigenous groups, that's not even how their reservation system is set up. Right. Maybe their tribe receives it. Right. But in a lot of contexts.
Yeah, it's in receivership or something a lot of times. Right. Like.
Right. So this creates a situation. Right. If we kind of keep it on this trajectory of there's interest in privacy or piracy, but also speculation of like all of a sudden, like now I want to be the title holder to actually receive the finance to service that river. Mm-hmm. And I think that after kind of COP28, that's kind of my take on like what's going to happen with like the fossil fuel system and kind of regime. It's like they can degrade really high right now. And then I think that largely they're going to be put into a position where they can immediately finance their own ability to provide ecosystem services, right? Or energy services or whatever. But yeah, I don't think anyone's kind of taking into consideration. And it is kind of funny, you talk about the long-term kind of component of these things, right? But for like a lot of these carbon assets, right, they don't take into consideration in their pricing the fact that carbon, like CO2, takes like 1,000 years to kind of process through the environment. So the actual like life cycle of carbon is not currently part of the equation for pricing for any of these assets, right? And I think partly that is due to the fact that that would put people on responsibility for hundreds, thousands of years, and that's just not on anyone's timetable.
Yeah, we don't really expect the government to last that long, frankly.
Right. So like, what's like the point of creating these assets and these credits if like you can't even imagine seeing them through fruition through like the imagined cycling of like a carbon particle that was like released.
Yeah, well, this is interesting for me to think about. Like, so in this conversation, we had three different contradictions and kind of emerge. One, we're pricing immediately for something that has consequences downstream for longer than most countries. Two, like existence cycle. Yeah. Two, we are. I mean, like when you point out about the receivership stuff and like clear property rights, I'm like, so we actually have not two but three non-compatible situations here. We have standard property rights. We have property as understood through treaty and subject people obligations through federal entities in North America. And then we have how the indigenous people see themselves, which we haven't even mentioned. Yeah. None of these things are copacetic. No. And then to make it all worse, there's a tacit admission in the pricing of this that you're not going to ultimately save it, whether that's what people are admitting or not. Because if it was an easily savable resource, you wouldn't price it in the first place.
Yeah.
So all of this is implied from the get-go.
Yeah.
In these arrangements, and that's crazy to think about. Like, and I think with carbon offsets and stuff, the standard lefty critique is beginning to get it. But for stuff like when you're mentioning natural wealth funds and like, and international conservatives of the Amazon or whatever, like that's another thing. Like, lefties are not really haven't even been really keeping up with this.
No,
like.
I don't think anyone is, honestly. I mean, except for the people who are, and again, like I'm not an ecologist or an economist because I think like right now they're kind of converging in interesting ways that are like very novel. And it's like only the people that are doing it are kind of aware of what's happening.
Right. Well, yeah, like economic ecology and ecological economics are a thing. And while the latter's been a thing for a while, the former is kind of brand new. And means a bunch of different things, honestly. But it is interesting because it's some of these things that, like, I've heard wind of some of this because I follow these things. But I had no idea that the U.S. was a leader on national wealth funds. Like that's natural wealth funds and stuff. Like that's not something that has even been on my radar. And I actually read ecological stuff, so it's interesting to see. I want to talk to you about this though, where in another way we can make this very clear, because a lot of this has come to a head, and in the most recent climate change conference, where like a whole lot of stuff came to a head, I think, and a lot of people who've been way too optimistic about, say, Paris or whatever it was, I forgot what
Paris Agreement,
and before Paris, have had to come to the real hard look at what it means when they saw this at COP28. Like,
yeah. I mean, we could dive through it. I mean, there's a lot there. I think the reporting on it has been like really interesting. And I think that the negative components of it are only surprising to you if you weren't paying attention.
Like, who haven't really been looking at it. Like you heard this on Democracy Now! Once and didn't really follow up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the biggest thing that was actually kind of not talked about, and I shared this with you, but basically like right after the meeting, I want to say is the day after or maybe the same day of the end of the meeting, was that the UN voted on establishing this kind of multilateral kind of system, and then also a bilateral system for trading carbon credits, right? And that got voted down, right? And basically, it was the EU against the US on this, right? Because the EU's had the emissions trading scheme for quite a while, I think since like 2006 or 2007. And that's a cap and trade system, right? So they kind of, for any kind of industry member, they kind of give an allowance, and you can kind of trade these allowances, and you can also apply for, you can get credits to kind of fill up the allowance or whatever. It's much more rigorous, right? And I think at the beginning of this year, I think the cost for like a credit was like 100 euros per ton of carbon. And then after that decision, it sunk to 66 euros. And then the US was like much more like, we need to just like push this through and like start seeing this happening, right? And I don't think people really understand that, like, yes, you can look at all the like fossil fuel transition stuff, and I love like transition fuels. We could talk about that all day. Like, you know, liquefied natural gas. It's like methane's not a real thing for some reason. So we have that stuff, right? We have all of the kind of taxes, or the kind of the subsidies and breaks for the fossil fuel sector to kind of transition in this arrangement, right? And then the major thing, again, with this kind of carbon credit thing, and I think this is what's really key to people, is that this was a kind of a fossil fuel industry petrostate COP, right? Not surprising. But they snuck it in at the end, which is like their major framework for abating carbon and other GHGs, right? Greenhouse gases, is reforestation and forest degradation prevention, right? So we're not only in a position, right? So make a long story short, I think we're in a position right now where basically the only mound of money that's going towards financing these kind of efforts, right, is private equity. And it's mostly focused, or like, you know, in the kind of other private capital, but it's like mostly focused on the same things that we knew weren't working going in, right? And I think the absence even of like a very weak international scheme for this means that we're just going down a rabbit hole where we're going to see more private investments in carbon credits, way more than anything, and the kind of solidifying that as like the major framework of this kind of, you know, some public-private arrangement and something like that. And I can kind of get more into the specifics, but I think that was the thing that kind of was like not on anyone's radar, was that I think people imagine that there's like a carbon credit market out there that's like very like, you know, standardized and real, and that like nations have like a lot of say in it, and it's like, you know, very highly, no, it's not, and it's like kind of the Wild West out there. And this just made sure that it's going to be the case for the next 2 years, and the next 2 years into the next petrostate COP28 in Azerbaijan. So like, I think the reason why I bring this up is like, I think people really need to take seriously, like, not only that we are pricing this, but who's paying for the price. And if private fossil capital is the one that's going to be paying the price for these things, we're really not in a position to respond well. And that's not even like talking about the liquefied natural gas stuff. That's like not talking about anything else, right? Is that pricing for ecosystem services, pricing for carbon is like now kind of completely in the hands of the private sector. Sorry.
Yeah, completely in the hands of this private sector and overseen by petrostates. Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, I don't know the number of late cap. Well, I always say we say late capitalist because we're being optimistic. Let's be honest. The number of contemporary contradictions that emerge from this are kind of astounding. Like, oh, we have a more diversified, less Eurocentric view, but who gets it now? The petrostates. And oh, we're pricing for these markets and these exist, except it's been the Wild West the entire time. Look at how Tesla makes money. Which, for those of you who don't know, Tesla's only profitable thing is carbon offsets. They're not even a profitable car company.
Yeah.
They're basically a property carbon offset rent-seeking coalition for stock price manipulation. and so, you know, you see that too. I mean, finally, people have been talking about the problems of the way green stuff has been implemented in the United States, both in terms of indigeneity, but also in terms of like, well, it's shittier jobs. Like, it's hard to get unions on board because it's shittier jobs. And so, and while that doesn't seem directly related, it actually is, because it tells you where these people's market mind is headed. Which is like pitting green stuff against labor industry, so that the cost for this are, you know, even if the environment is somewhat damage is somewhat mitigated, the cost is actually priced to poor people and vulnerable people, etc., to the working class, to the indigenous who are having to do labor to maintain it, etc., and not to the people actually fucking doing everything. So like, it becomes very clear how this all works, and that the standard liberal answers to it, which, you know, I mean, I've noticed this for a while. Even like good centrist liberals have become more and more skeptical of carbon offsets. But at the same time, like, they're always blathering on about how we need to meet the Paris Accords. And I'm like, well, your framework and your framework don't match. Like, you see the problems in this part of the framework, but you keep on holding us to this framework, which ties us to this framework, which you see is flawed. And you have no alternative for it. And the longer this goes on, the more we're caught flat-footed by stuff like COP28, because it's just clear that you know, we don't have a lot of power in dictating how this pricing is going to go.
No, or where it happens, right? And I think to your point about like look at green jobs, right? You know, I think it's pretty clear, and I haven't looked into this too much, and I'd be interested to see, because again, I'm like working my personal work, and a lot of the groups I work with are rural indigenous communities. But this is actually a good example. So like, if I go to a tribe in Michigan and I want to do forest restoration, or you know, a forest kind of reducing forest degradation or something like that, to kind of get payments from the state or some sort of carbon credits, right? I might actually have a worse valuation for the price of that carbon, either for the service or for the carbon itself, because it's in the United States, because of how the pricing and how the standards were set between the two kind of things I talked about in the beginning, SEA and FEEB, is that if you're like an indigenous person in a settler colonial nation, you're in a wealthy nation. So even if you're in a rural, poor context and you've experienced historical degradation and you're overcoming that historical degradation to provide this service, your price for that specific type of ecosystem, and I can kind of get into the weirdness of like how they identify ecosystems and price it, but how they price for that ecosystem is based upon the nation that you're in. Which, you know, when I think about like, this is like the thing that I want to scream at anyone is like, hey, they want to make a big deal about how indigenous peoples are providing services to nature, right? That they live within nature and provide services back, right? Like I get paid to do this, but the river gives me fish, so I take care of it, kind of thing. This kind of cyclical relationship to it, right? That's whatever. Why can't that, like I think that there's like a real danger where I'm like, hey, for anyone in a city, you also exist in an ecosystem that has services, that provides services directly to you, right? We don't necessarily approach the management or the maintenance of those ecosystems from the same way. And I actually think that that's just like a missed opportunity, right? Which I think is just kind of like a funny thing. It's just like, no, like, well, what would it look like to actually diversify or kind of transition, fossil fuel energy production, you know, labor, like that labor markets into other jobs. Not to say that we could kind of transition those people into those, right? I don't think the training's there, but like, it's a different solution than like, hey, miners, go become like energy techs, like, you know, solar energy techs, and install these farms, you know, out in Idaho or something like that. It's like, no, like, what if we could actually approach this from like, we need to start thinking about the services within our urban centers that also require services from us to maintain. And I think that that's like, again, it's just like a basic missed opportunity. Yeah.
Well,
But
yeah. I mean, one of the secret obsessions with Varland is the rural urban divide and the town and country divide in terms of organizing and thinking about these problems. And you actually bring up another problem and another Varn vlog bugaboo that no one else seems to talk about. I'm not saying I'm the only person who talks about it, but weirdly, the only people I know who talk about it are liberals. And that is the bizarre outcomes of methodological nationalism when you're dealing with stuff like, I don't know, core and peripheral relations within said nation as opposed to outside of it. Like, and on an international framework, like, oh yeah, the U.S. is rich, so clearly we don't need to pay as much for this. They've already offset off this third world anyway. Except that if you're in a Black community in Augusta, Georgia, and I say that because I used to live across the street from one, or if you're in any res anywhere ever, almost, maybe there's some ones I don't know about that aren't in this situation, but like everyone I've ever seen has been, you're in like both a rural area, but also usually in something that's been affected negatively by some environmental justice concern. And yet you're going to get priced as if you're from, I don't know, not even a city, but like from like suburban Vermont, where things are almost idyllic. Like it's just, it's absurd. But on the same token, it also perpetuates the town and country divide because you're right. There are like urban environments are still fucking environments, and like there's animals in them. There's all kinds of stuff. Like increasingly, we're gonna have to figure out how to do urban agriculture. Like it's just something that these frameworks just fundamentally do not handle this at all. They actually weirdly kind of assume like mid 20th century Western rural urban developmental patterns, which I don't even think are universally all that true anymore. So like, it's bizarre. And definitely aren't true. And like, for example, we're talking about these carbon states, but if you've ever been to the UAE, like that's not that's like the environment is not even that rural. It's like a pastoral landscape with malls on the moon. Like it's basically what that place is. And how would you environmentally price for that? I don't know, because it's not like the environment in the UAE is particularly great, but it's also like, I mean, it is affected, but it's not particularly environmentally degraded. It was already desert. So it just seems to me absurd to look at it this way. Like these ownership claims are far too discrete a mechanism to ever actually capture all this. And yet I'm still with you. Like in an immediate practical sense, what are you to do? You have to operate in this framework. Like, like if you are, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think that's like the thing I'm facing, right? And I think we haven't even addressed the question of like, should we try to account for all of an ecosystem? Like, what does that even like mean? Like, what does it mean to try to account for like all of our also human land relationships? Like, even not necessarily like in a monetized way, but like in any kind of like quantified way. Like, what is that? Like, what does that kind of data crunching look like, and like the kind of energy cost for that? And is it even like the most energy efficient way for managing ecosystems? I actually don't know if that's the case.
This was you commented on an episode of my show with Ingalls Demora, and we also are like, hey guys, when we talk about this, we don't even actually factor the carbon cost of monitoring carbon costs all the time. Like it's, which is a thing, and is like not are the environmental destruction costs to getting samples to measure environmental destruction, which is a weird thing. So you should like, there is a sense like, how would you even commodify it in this atomized way? Like, I don't even know that you can. And if you do, all right, who pays the cost of the environmental cost of monitoring the environmental cost? Like,
And I mean, I think that there is like this question, right? That it's like, and that no one, I mean, of course, we're at the national level or the kind of international levels, like trying to deal with this, but it's just like, what if we can't? What if we can't measure? Like that's like just like a fundamental, like philosophical question. Like, what if we can't account for everything? And then if we can account for everything, does that actually creating accounts? Why do we actually have a belief that this metaphor or this model of human land relationships is going to engender the kind of management that we want to have? And I think history's shown that, like, and I appreciate the Demaro conversation. Yeah, I did watch that because I think, yeah, like, in real world kind of like socialist states, like they definitely did like a very different type of kind of like of ecological planning, and I appreciate his kind of history on that. But I think that there's just like something to be said of like kind of now, right where we're at now is like, I don't really understand any kind of imagination that we're just like we're making bad environmental choices because we don't have enough data. Like that's not what's happening. Like we're not like, and that any and I think this is something I get mad at when I talk to my collaborators or my colleagues, where they're like, well, let's show the risk. Like, let's show how much carbon indigenous communities are sequestering through their kind of common practices, right? Let's look at the risk let's look at how much that carbon is at risk. Let's try to make indigenous life and life ways either too profitable, like so profitable that they'll be invested in, or too risky to be breached. And I'm like, why are we thinking that that's actually a winning position? And I actually think this is like a position for most peoples, is actually like, why do we believe that we can just show that climate change or these kind of ecological impacts are either too risky, and that somehow the response to that risk is going to be greater responsibility, right? That's just not how that's going to happen.
No, if anything, one of the things that I've been quite frustrated on is like, hey guys, the more you actually see the outcome of climate change, the more doubling down from cognitive dissonance you see from deniers. Like the closer we've gotten to seeing effects of climate change, for example, and the higher the risk are. Yeah. The people who say no are more likely to say no because you're triggering a safety defense response. Like, like to me, it's like, in some ways, it's like, yeah, this is like cognitive feedback loop 101, and yet you can't get it through. No, I would love to say it's just liberals' heads, but it's not. It's anyone's heads. And the analogy here, I mean, tell me if you think this is a stretch, but it's like, to the fact that like all the liberal jurists in law decided one day that they were going to come up with a liberal form of originalism to fight like the conservative originalism, when you're like, well, but the entire paradigm that you're adopting is fucked. And like by adopting it and trying to make a liberal version of it, you're actually conceding a point that dooms you in the first place. And I think that's actually kind of true with this. Like, let's account for all these risks in monetary terms, and then like try to do a cost savings analysis. And I'm like, well, honestly, the stakes don't work that way. Like, environmental damage don't work that way, and you can't. And like it's interesting to me because people have gotten big in the pricing this at the very time moment in liberalism. We're like, well, we can't place things that have this, this kind of high externalities on them because like healthcare, because it leads to market failure. And then I'm like, why the fuck are you trying to do it the climate change? Because that's got even a higher like risk reward / externality costs. Like it's that's absurd. Maybe we should just, I don't want to say that like, hey, maybe we have to change the whole paradigm because that leads to people thinking like, oh, we can just change the way we talk about it. But in another sense, like, yeah, maybe we have to change the whole paradigm and like change the way, like this way of talking about the environment, which treats it as an unvalorized commodity, isn't gonna fucking help us at all. Like it's just not. And I mean, that doesn't mean I have an easy answer for how to spin this, but I want to talk about, this is a very real and live question for you as somebody deals with this in the context of Hawaii and in Pacific, like cultural problems in general. We've just had an instance of Hawaii getting the shit end of the the environmental feedback loop stick.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the federal government has handled it as poorly as I would have expected it to. But what can we learn from that situation?
Ooh, that's a good question. I so I think something that was really, and I'm pretty closely kind of raptured in that situation, right? I was there. I was actually like on the mountain where the fire happened the day before the fire happened.
Holy shit!
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I was like across the channel on the island I'm from, Molokai, doing forest restoration on like a deserted, like largely desertified, like kind of like mountain face facing Lahaina, and the winds were hitting us, and we're covered in dirt, and we could see just like the probably tons of like of just dust going into the ocean, into the air, and just feeling it. And then we got off the mountain, we got cell surface, and then we saw that the fires were happening. And then immediately people jumped into action. So I think that there's a few things to learn from Lahaina, right? Is I think that from Lahaina. I mean, Hawaii is a kind of a unique case. I think what was like, interesting is that people imagine that mutual aid networks, and again, there was a really powerful mutual aid network that kind of arose out of that condition, are going to be able to quickly respond and mobilize to deal with kind of climate crises, not just from like the kind of mutual aid component, but in that moment, I remember being on several calls where people were like, we need to immediately set up a land trust to start buying up these lands, right? Because Lahaina wasn't one parcel, right? It's hundreds of thousands of parcels, right? A lot of it is local families, but a lot of it were kind of not as non-occupied ownership, right? So a lot of external owners who use them as TVRs or temporary vacation rentals. And we were like, we need to be in a position to actually just kind of do land back or land forward or whatever you want to call it, and get all this land really quickly. And I think the biggest lesson learned, and I remember having this interaction with people, was like, I know that this feels like the right moment to respond, but I think it's really easy to underestimate the trauma of this shit when it's happening, and the ability to actually mobilize afterwards, right? And now Lahaina is in a position, and they actually established a land trust to start getting some of these lands back. But people were like imagining that we could do it within 48 hours of like, hey, we should start talking. Yeah, I know. They're like, we need to do this now because all of a sudden, all of these private investors are going to jump in.
I mean, to be completely fair to them, during BLM and some of the moments during COVID, even I would get swept up. I'm like, we can do this really quick, and then I'm like, I know better.
Yeah.
Right. But in the moment, the urgency plus the trauma kick in, and you're just like, we got to do what we got to do. We got to believe what we got to believe to be able to do this. And I don't know if I have to fool myself, but goddamn it, I'm going to do it. Right. Yeah. Like, and asking traumatized people to make that decision about themselves is not necessarily the best fucking like way to go about that either. I mean,
so that happened immediately. And then I think in the long term of it, I think the difficulty has been that there wasn't, again, the island I come from is a very different context. And I can kind of talk about why that context is different and why people were like looking to us to be able to provide guidance. And I was like, you just haven't been doing this. But I don't think people understand how far their political capacity is from dealing with questions of zoning, dealing with questions of taxes, property taxes, whatever you want to deal with it, property acquisition. Like I haven't seen a lot of robust, I don't want to generalize to the left, but like that is actually a hard or like a growing edge, if you want to say. And then we've seen in the immediate response to this, right, there was a political attack on a Native Hawaiian judge who supported a community water authority, because up until then the plantation system had been established and was allowing kind of a large Canadian pension fund to pass through the water. There's a whole story there, right? But that was going to happen, right? And then in the other terms, right, there was this kind of solution which is, so most properties on Maui are owned externally or owned from the people who do not live there, right?
Right.
A lot of them are temporary vacation rentals. So these are Airbnbs, right? So the mayor and the governor were like, hey, we'll give you, I forgot, I have to look this up, I apologize, but they're basically like, look, you won't have to pay any taxes on these lands or on your property. Can you reduce these prices and actually make them long-term rentals? And when you're looking at the margins on like what, we can imagine maybe the margins on some of these, when you're talking about someone who can put an Airbnb up for way more than you could ever imagine, right? This was just like not a fix. And it's kind of laughable that they kind of, that instead of mandating that all of this housing actually be used, all of this housing stock that's basically just used for vacationers actually receive the population, that was not on the table. So this is just to say, like, I think people really need to be prepared that when you're looking at the level of mass trauma that comes with environmental crises and organizing in response to that, I mean, that just takes years of preparation, right? And even then, I think we have to think about how to be savvy and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, because it is an opportunity to change things, right? Maybe people can interpret it that way, but it's very different than like something like BLM, right? Or when George Floyd happened, like when 1,000 people die, or 2,000 people die, or 4,000 people, when several thousand people don't have houses anymore. That's a very different organizing question, right?
Yeah. I lived through a flood in central Georgia in 1992 where like we didn't have running water. Like I don't think that many people died. I think maybe 50, 60 died, but like we didn't have running water for 2 whole fucking months. Yep. And also like there was massive displacement of homes for up to 2 or 3 years. And even that is more trauma than I think people are used to. And people are like, oh, traumatized communities. I'm like, yeah, but it's not the same. Like it's this is acute. On one hand, I completely agree with you. It's not like BLM, and BLM that's a bubbling up of something that's under the radar. It comes from trauma, but it's a different kind of thing. This is like. But Katrina is an example of like where this can go real south real fast.
Yeah.
And I was involved in Katrina restoration work, and that got heated for a variety of reasons. Yeah. But it was like even, and that was one of those areas where mutual aid wasn't even partisan for once. Like you get everybody out there, and yet. It was another fucking shit show, and we didn't stop any neoliberalization from happening. And like we got side flanked on like every major infrastructure, including education. Like it was something to think about. Yet the other challenge I have to these people is like, well, the other way people go, they go, well, mutual aid doesn't work. Let's go this electoral route. Yeah. And I'm like, doesn't do anything for Hawaii. It doesn't do anything for for that situation, and it wouldn't. Like, so what are you going to do? And I think the one thing that we have to do is start preparing that, one, this is going to be common. 2, we need resistant, non-NGO, probably non-party political organizations that can handle this, that also are very locally embedded, because one of the other problems that you have is I can't take the context from me here in Utah to you in Hawaii in any meaningful sense.
I'm in Michigan, but
yeah. I know. I actually know that, but like we're using Hawaii as an example now. But actually, me here in Utah, you in Michigan.
Yeah.
Like your problems are different than mine. Like there's environmental degradation problems in both places. You got water and I don't.
Depending on who you are, right?
Yes, but like the water exists where you are.
Yeah, that's true. The
water does not exist here.
Yeah.
Like we got one respite from the oncoming arsenic cloud because we had a good snow year last year.
Yeah.
But we're still actually not in any way undone from the otherwise 5 years drought. And it's one of those times when I lived in Georgia and people were talking about, well, it's a drought for we've been in drought for 20 years. And I'm like, if you're in drought for 20 years, you're not in drought anymore.
Yeah.
You just live in a different place and
yeah,
you have to change your infrastructure. Like the world has changed. You can't blame that on La Nina or whatever. So I mean
I think
actually,
you're right.
Yeah, and actually, in the case of Georgia, to even get more environmentally cynical, part of the drought problems isn't even the environmental problem. It's the fact that it's almost impossible to go and fix the infrastructure the way they want to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
So you have increasingly more people on increasingly less infrastructure, and the infrastructure is super, super shitty. But it costs more to pull up the infrastructure than it does to just let it all collapse.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what's going on around Atlanta. But here, that's not the problem here in Utah. All the infrastructure is fairly new.
Mm-hmm.
Our problem is that we're a fucking desert, and people keep on moving here. And and then Michigan, you have these curtailment of water rights. Also, you have that here, but how it looks is very different. We had to fight to not lose the right to collect water for our gardens, because the way water rights work. By the way, owning land in Utah does not actually entitle you to either ground or air water.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's great. So even as a property owner, you're kind of fucked. Those are separate rights which have to be bought separately. And they finally conceded to us being able to collect rainwater for gardening. But they were suing people for that. And what's funny is I would hear about that shit in Bolivia when U.S. corporate, but no one would talk about it's happening in communities here. It's just developed from state to state. And if you try to do this from a national policy perspective, you probably don't know that, because the one thing about the United States is we're a wildly federated country. Mm-hmm. But I also think even if we weren't, you shouldn't expect to be able to do good policy management from DC for landscapes as different as the high desert, Pacific Islands, the Great Lakes Basin, and the southeast coastal area. Those are radically different things on something the size of, actually when you throw in the Pacific Islands, larger than a continent. So it's go ahead.
One thing I love, and this is a kind of a factoid, is that the parcel of land that we're trying to get back in Molokai is larger than DC. And that's wild to think about. But I think to your point about this, and I don't have kind of and so what I'll do is I'll kind of describe the context that I'm working in, so that maybe people understand why I'm kind of concerned about these things, right? So the reason why the island of Molokai, you can actually begin in this process of trying to acquire this land, is because you have a population of 7,000, give or change, right? Around roughly 60% Native Hawaiian, a large kind of Asian, descendant of migrant farm worker population, and then a mix of European, Canadian snowbirds or US snowbirds and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And something that's really interesting there is 1/3 of the population is on food stamps, right? And then when you look at the Native Hawaiian population, that 60%, they get about 1/3 of their foodstuffs from subsistence. And I don't think people really understand what does it mean to kind of operate in an enclosed geographical area with relatively small population, but where people can kind of opt out when it comes to this kind of question of wage labor or whatever it is, because you can be poor on Molokai, but you won't go hungry, or you can find housing, right? And the big concern I have is that we're about to get this land, right? Mm-hmm. And this is kind of where I think a lot of efforts kind of tumble, especially a lot of land back efforts, a lot of indigenous efforts, is you get the land, all of a sudden you have a spreadsheet, or you have a budget that you need to manage, or you have infrastructure you need to manage. You have to incorporate your charter, And those relationships that actually provided you the context of getting there, right? Like the reason why this land is being sold is because we pushed out a Hong Kong based, like wealthy private equity firm, right? We've like basically prevented them from developing here so much that they're like, forget it. We don't want to be here. Right. And there's kind of some shenanigans there, right? But like basically that's like what's happened. And now that we're in a position to actually get it, I'm actually more concerned for the community, right? I'm actually like, shoot, like once we get the land, once we actually have to start managing and planning ourselves with being land rich and or cash rich, right? We actually have like a cash flow all of a sudden. Why we should not presume that our social relationships, our kinship networks, our subsistence networks are actually robust enough to survive the penetration of money. And I think everyone kind of has to accept that.
Yeah, this is I hate this is an overused white person metaphor about indigenous life, but in this case, it is a good example. What happens when the casino comes to the res and the res is flush with cash? Like, but not anything else. Like it is a real, you know, and also like, hey, now that you I talk about this a lot in another context in decolonization. Like I'm always like, you know, the great irony of decolonization in places like Africa and the Middle East and is like they weren't nations there beforehand, and then there were nations, and then they somehow had to make that work and also decolonize. But the only reason there are nations there at all is a synthetic importation to actual colonial international law frameworks, and also like because you have to act like the colonizer to be able to participate in the system, in which case it reduces some of this to gentlemen's agreements, and like it all gets very ugly very quick. But in you know, like, you know, you guys are doing land back, more power to you. I'm glad. You know, I like in the capitalist context, I'm all about that. Yet also, well, now you own property like a colonizer. Like, you know, like,
yeah, no, I've thought about that a lot.
Under their law. So like, you know, and you know, like I know that the superficial conservative is like, gotcha, we were right all along. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm like, there's not like there is a way in which you are stuck with that. Like you do have to live in that context. And like if we expect you not to, we're setting you up to fail. But also it has effects that will change your kinship relations and maybe even make you look, I don't know, like I always think of like Amos Cesare, who always talks about like the colonizer society is also the colonizing society is also sick. Like in and of itself. And I'm like, man, do you want our illnesses or not? Like and that's always something to and different groups handle it differently. I don't think it's inevitable that it goes poorly, but it is going to do something. Right. And you know, that's normally when I throw my pitch for our way out of it is socialist revolution, comrade. But like even that, I'm beginning to be like, I don't know. In the back of my mind, the example that I was talking to my friend Sean of Antifada about was like, you know, the Bolsheviks really tried to give everyone a nation except for those pesky non-national Siberian indigenous. Like, they could never figure out what the fuck to do with. And what did they do with them? Pretty much the same thing that the U.S. and Canada did with its indigenous. Was like a Russification or some kind of like, well, pick a nation, goddammit. Like, we don't care that that's not who you are. And that's kind of been on the back of my mind because I'm like, okay, like, so we say we're going to get out of the settler framework, but you know, this came up in the context of our land back or land forward or whatever you want to call it. Like most indigenous people both know by sheer law of large numbers and also get that it's not that most people want blood and soil nationalism. Yes, some people do. We can't flatten that out, but most people don't, right? Yet, as soon as we talk about this framework, that's automatically where we go because that seems to be the only European framework for it. And then, like, what do you do? Like, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I do think like one thing that maybe we should do is shut the fuck up and actually start listening to each other, and also to some degree, maybe start thinking about the problems of accepting the framework in the first place. But when it comes to financial stuff, I don't know how you don't. Like, and mutual aid, God bless it. I'm all about it. Don't get me wrong. I'm not an anti-mutual aider. I'm not like, oh, don't do mutual aid. Give money to the electoral campaign.
I think my point about the mutual aid was that, like, you're talking about a context where that, like, for some reason, right? And Lahaina has a lot of, like, even though it's like a large kind of tourism component of Maui, right? Still relatively like close-knit community. And then, like, for people who are experiencing or who are going to experience climate crisis, are you like, do not rest on your laurels, to some extent. And, like, and even kind of, even if you feel like you're far away from it, do not rest on your laurels. I think, again, like, you should just be assuming that if you can't even make that happen, you probably can't make the other thing happen, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah. I mean, I do think there's a whole Rebecca Solnit article like people come together in crisis, and I'm like, yeah, we do, but that doesn't mean that when we come together, we're thinking clearly.
Yeah.
Like, or that we're realistic. A lot of times, hope reigns supreme, and sometimes hope is fucking dumb.
Yeah.
And even I, like, Mr. Me being usually pretty okay with being the cynical one in the room when someone's mourning the loss of, I don't know, 100, 1,000, 2,000 of their community members. I'm not going to shit on their hope, but I'm also like, and I'm not going to not be tempted to delude myself. Like, in those moments, it's real hard not to. I've seen many times where communities face something like this and they come together and that's all good. But the shadow side is like they're traumatized and that can cut in a million different ways. But a lot of those million different ways are bad, like probably more than are good. From scapegoating to like dreaming big in ways that make you to make, short-term irresponsible decisions, to being outflanked because you're not being cynical enough about certain parties in your midst. Like, all this is all a reality that's going to come up. And when it comes to climate change, and to bring it back to our original context, how the fuck are we supposed to price that?
Yeah.
Like what I was actually thinking about this the other day in the context of Hawaii. I'm like, what kind of FEMA check can I possibly throw at you that does anything? Like, really? Like,
Yeah. I mean, I think this is like kind of what's funny with like kind of, I don't know, natural capital accounting or natural wealth accounting and kind of extending it to ecosystem services and then like flirting with like valuing and pricing culture is like, I like the idea that people imagine that like Indigenous communities are going to be like allowed to bring their bill. So like it's kind of like the imagination I have is like they're gonna just show up and be like, here's the bill, not even for the last 400 years, just for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
Right.
$3 trillion of pain and suffering, please.
Right. And it wouldn't be wrong, but what does that mean? Like, what does that matter? And that's never been the point of these things, right? And it's
so much that it is the point. Like I think about the most corrupted in a reparations discourse, and I always think about that example of that ask, which no one intended to give in San Francisco, where they're like, we're going to give all Indigenous people $1 million. I mean, not all Indigenous, all Black people who can prove their stay here, but which, by the way, would be all of 60 people.
Right.
But like $1 million, and which of course is also going to raise the tax rate like 50% for everybody, which is also going to make them hate it. Like, it's everything about that. But of course, no one ever intended to do that either. When it comes to Indigenous stuff, it's like I always think about this, like, how do I price that? And who gets to represent it? Like, to some ways, like, okay, if we talk about like the peoples of the eastern seaboard in the United States, like, we're talking about like 5 people sometimes that we can prove have any actual relation to these historical peoples. And that's kind of an exaggeration, but it's not much of one. And And like, what do we do about that? And how do I compensate the annihilation of most of your culture and persons? I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't even know that I should. Like,
well, people are, and I think that's what's funny. And I think they're trying to do it in the positive sense, right? I think that they're like, look, we can't pay for what's lost, but we can pay for what's here, kind of thing. And they're like, okay, for the community. And again, what ends up happening, which kind of feeds into this nationalism, blood and soil nationalism question, and like kind of how Indigenous peoples get wrapped up into this, is that for communities that look a certain, not even like physically look, but kind of like how their society operates. Like, let's say you're in the Yucatan, right? Let's say or in Oaxaca or something like that, right? And there's multiple dozens of indigenous communities there. But for some reason, your community, pastoral farmers, right? You raise cattle, right? Whereas other people are like forest dwellers, right? All of a sudden, the ways in which this green finance happens is like, oh, I really want to finance the language immersion programs, the cultural practice, and the maintenance of the forest dwellers. And then for the cattle farmers, I'm gonna
fuck those Zapotecs down the street.
Yeah, exactly, exactly what I was thinking of. And
yeah, I've spent enough time walking to know you.
Yeah, I was like,
but yeah,
yeah. So you get these situations, right, which creates, that's like one kind of contradiction in these things where like, it really does, this is like this new form of pricing will create indigeneity or create, and not to say that I think indigeneity has kind of always been about the question of price, especially with like land, like that's never been separate, and like treaties and kind of that question, but it's a new formation of this, right? And I think that there was a question of like,
do you trust us to price when you couldn't trust us with treaties?
I don't trust.
I mean, like, just want to like in a very simple sense, it's like you price, treaty, both agreements under law. Do you think we're going to do a whole lot better? I mean, we might, but like, there's more awareness. At the same token, like, I don't know. I'm fundamentally skeptical of this pricing regime stuff, but at the same time, but on the other hand, I'm also like, but like, I am sympathetic to like me saying that pricing sucks, so we should do nothing. Is also fucked up. So it's like it really is sort of like, how do we, like, what do we balance here?
What's the next step?
What's the next step? And then when I think for this, like, you're right, like we also have, like, this creates a scale of indigeneity that's weirdly kind of, I mean, orientalizing is the wrong word, but it's the analogous concept. Like, the more exotic and primitive you are, the more likely we are to pay you. Which will set up all kinds of bizarre hierarchies within indigenous groups who maybe didn't have tensions before. And it's not like, that hasn't happened before. So it's just, and in the long run, I start thinking about what happens when we have to start dealing with this with all the populations, like where you can't, when you can't just be like, oh, well, there's this historically aggrieved group. I mean, yes, we go down to the next historically aggrieved group, which is marginalized people like Black and brown people. But then eventually you're like I point this out. It's been implicit in my debates with a certain Mr. Drum, or Dr. Drum, where I'm like,
respected name,
the good, respectable Dr. Drum, where I'm like, well, but like, you talk about white supremacy, and you're absolutely correct. I have no disagreement with you on the prevalence. It's real and it's in property relations or whatever. But like, while there are benefits to whiteness that occur to all white people, absolutely, I get it. You can't say that property accumulation is one of them, like in the same way, and in a way that's going to eventually manifest in the quote dominant group, unquote, because the class relations will become very clear, very sad. I mean, to me, it's like, you already see this with environmental justice stuff and health justice stuff in the rural and exurban South. Like, where you're just seeing like people's life expectancy, if you live in these areas, just dropping to shit. And it's like, well, we got rid of the the black white poor gap by just letting poor white people die. So I guess that's equality. We're all equal in death, I suppose. And that's, I don't think that's what anybody wants. I mean, I really don't think that's what the great majority of Indigenous people want. And one of the weirdest things about the current Indigenous discourse is like, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, Malu.
You're safe. It's a safe place.
But sometimes I'm like, we only talk to the Indigenous people who speak white activist language.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Like
I know a lot of super conservative.
Well, I've actually like totally looked at the stats for what res politics are, and that it would dramatically surprise people. But in another way, I always think about it like this is not a gotcha for me. It's like, well, how would you talk to them, and what do they want, and why are they that way? Because I actually don't think Indigenous conservatism actually looks like white elite conservatism at all.
Oh, no.
But it is like rural priorities versus urban priorities, and who are they likely to like listen to? And for reasons that I think have come up in this, like we don't have a good response for that, like at all, like absolutely not. And
yeah, so there's two things there, because so I think the first thing, right, is if anyone's like listening to this and like wants to take a lesson away from this, like why you should care about pricing for these services, why you should care about pricing of nature, is that you're not being asked, you're not engaging, you're not part of that pricing valuation process either, right? Like almost no one who's listening to this is, if anything, Indigenous peoples might be closer because they actually have some form of national sovereignty or kind of collective recognition, right? But I think that that's actually the canary in the coal mine, is that, hey, this thing's happening at global, national, and even to some extent state scales, because like California has a emissions trading scheme. And I'm like, no, we should all probably be pretty concerned with what these prices are. And I think if you asked anyone, like, what is fresh air to your child? Like, what is that worth? You'd actually probably get a pretty similar response across the group. I mean, I actually do think
like mostly everything. Like
like everything. Like, what do you mean? Like, what is that even? Like, I should be pretty. So there's that, right? So I think people need to take it seriously. Is that you're like, it's not like that's on like any kind of national ballot. It's not on any kind of state ballot. No one's coming to you and being like, let's vet this valuation process, right?
Yeah, they're not even asking you to pick the people who decide it. Like,
no, they're not doing that either.
Like, so yeah.
So there's that. And then when it came to the question of the conservatism component, right? And I think people who don't understand Indigenous tribal history and kind of the history of tribal law, which is like the most thing, is that Republicans actually generally were better for us, or not us, right, but better for
the GOP is better at respecting tribal sovereignty, because they're better at respecting sovereignty in general. And also, I know I talk about this a lot on the show, and it makes everyone uncomfortable that there's a whole like, in the 19th century, you can be good on Indigenous issues or you can be good on Black issues, but I never found anyone who was good on both.
Yeah, so no one's
like, like it's like the Confederacy, weirdly good on tribal recognitions.
Yeah.
In a way that's disturbing. And then Mark Twain, great on Black people for the time. Not so much by our standards, but definitely for the time. Terrible on Indigenous people, but
really good about
bad.
International imperialism. If you ever read any stuff on like the U.S. Spanish stuff and kind of the Philippines and even Hawaii, that's like slightly better. But yeah, he's pretty bad on Indigenous stuff. But like,
he was a critic of incorporating Hawaii. I mean, he was part of the Anti-Imperialism League.
Yeah,
but and also that's a league. Like everyone's like, oh, they were all Marxist Leninists or whatever. Like, no, half of them are. Like, basically, half of them are progressives who are not on the, like, Teddy Roosevelt proto-fascist progressivist train. Yeah. And then the other half are basically fucking neo-Confederates. like who were like afraid of letting more brown people in.
Yeah.
And so they're just like, let's stop this imperial project because like we have enough brown people. Stop it. And I mean, I always talk about this with the Polk plan to take Mexico all the way down to Mexico City, like and basically leave like Oaxaca, Chiapas, and the Yucatan wasn't even part of Mexico yet. So
yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? Stop that. It's a mixture of like one guy who felt bad for what we were doing because he went down as the ambassador and like saw what was happening, and then when he came back up, he teamed up with a bunch of racists to like stop the expansion at the Rio Grande, which like I'm just like, so I point that out because if you know that history, the actual tribal politics is like, it's not as irrational as you think. Plus, it's just like I like to tell people like most reses are super fucking rural. So their concerns are rural, and Democrats have not, outside of the Farm Bill in the 30s, had a good rural policy at all.
Also really religious. Like, so some of the biggest centers of like religious like density. Same with Hawaii, right? You know, at least amongst its indigenous population. I mean, the island I come from is like 1/3 Mormon, I think, and like then I think
I always forget about the weird Mormon thing with the Pacific Islanders because like when they decide this is a fun thing because one of the interesting things if you ever come to Salt Lake City is there's a bunch of fucking Samoans and Tongans here, and you're just like, why? How the hell did you end up here? And then you discover like, oh. Well, when the Mormons were deciding that they were getting over their curse of Ham stuff and their Lamanite curse stuff, I literally did a show on this. You guys can go and listen to it. And their Lamanite curse stuff, they decided to like go to the Pacifica people because they were Indigenous-esque, but you know we haven't tried to genocide them, so we don't have to like answer for that. And also like maybe they can become white and delightsome. So
I mean, it's like also because like, how do I say this? The other Protestants had already done a lot of good work across the continent. It was just like, there was like, you know, and the Protestants were pretty good going out imperially, right? But like, in the ABCFM,
are the Catholics or Orthodox? Some Christian group had already reached you if you were local Indigenous, like.
But the Mormons were like, we're ready to go. You know, we need to find our spots.
Hawaii, Tonga, and Samoa, like.
Right. And I mean, so I think to that question, and actually, I think this is like where someone like Colin Drum is really useful, right? Is when it comes to like this tension of like why Democrats versus Republicans on what we understand as like Black issues or like a kind of like Black racial issues prior to in the 19th century to the 20th and Indigenous issues. Why are they kind of not mixing, right? I think it does kind of come down to this like fundamental like difference in this tension of like property rights and kind of sovereignty.
Right. Absolutely.
And like, you know, again, these people receive the imposition of those different ideologies, right? But that's kind of been the battleground between what we might understand the difference between even civil rights and Indigenous rights, right? They're just actually kind of differences in like one's kind of a property arrangement, one's not to some extent. And not having a language of like having to deal with that. And again, I think that this is why, you know, I always harp on people. I'm like, you know, you should be really concerned with kind of the most boring, menial kind of exhaustive questions of like zoning, taxing, and property in your like locale, right? Like, how do I say this? Like, municipal bond law, right? Yeah, I mean, Detroit. I mean, seriously, right? California, right? I mean,
I've been harping on this lately, but it's like really, guys, learn your municipal bond law, get your zoning rules, and how you fund shit, what taxes go where. Now, I have an advantage of this, having been a teacher and been like, hey, we can open the school, but we can't staff it because the school comes from one line and the staffing of the school comes from a completely different line of taxation. Like, and in 2007, 2008, Malu, that led to some very weird situations where like we had to lay off 25% of our staff, but we have to open a new school and we got to staff it with like 5 people.
Yeah.
and that's purely because people don't understand how the tax lines go. Like they're like, well, I approved, X sales tax for whatever, and I'm like, yeah, but that's specifically for the specific line item. You can't touch it. And honestly, also, when people think, oh, progressive funding of schools, some of the most progressive funding of school states are red states, and they're actually that way because of the problems of rural schooling. So, for example, Utah equalizes its school funding.
That's awesome. I love that. That's so cool.
Like the state level fund. Like, yes, local taxes go to local things first, but all the rest of the funding is equalized, and it's equalized per student as of like Sweden. So like we have competition for students that leads to FDE stuff, but we all get paid the same amount. And I'm like, and that's so much more progressive than New York State.
Yeah.
Which your immediate like municipality, like borough, actually, like, or suburb, I don't even know, it's not even a borough, like funds your school, and also it's led to the most segregated and like and wealth non-integrated school system in the public school system on the planet.
Right.
And it's just like, so these things don't cut the way you think they do, because you often don't understand the difference between how like urban and rural states work, which is not me arguing that like rural states are great. Trust me, I live in Utah. I fucking suck. But like the problems are different. And when you get really, I think when you realize that, all of a sudden, like the tribal politics makes more sense. Like, and also when they cut over, like, why did the Dine, why did the Navajo Nation get woke? Like, it wasn't because they all of a sudden became good Democrats. It's because they saw the policies leading to mass Navajo death rates during COVID.
Yeah.
And the Democrats were slightly better, so they voted for them. Like, but that was a historic, that was like a
shift.
A historic shift.
Yeah.
Yeah. That no one even really paid, like, people paid that much attention to, but they thought it was ideological. And I'm like, it's not, because it's not ideological in the way you think. It's literally like a health policy issue. Like,
yeah, they to some extent. I mean, again, like, and then we talked about this before. Maybe we've mentioned this in passing in some other ways. It's like, I don't think Indigenous peoples are special. Like, there's nothing special about indigeneity. I'll like kind of admit that. I don't want to be Indigenous. I don't like it. I don't want to. Like, I wish it didn't have to be. But what we do, like, if there is anything unique about Indigenous peoples and like why we should be engaged, is that we just have like different memory. We just remember different things, and then part of that is we sometimes have different formations, like political formations, kinship formations, social formations. And I think what you're talking about, which we also saw here in Michigan in the previous election, right, during COVID, where we got the Democrat trifecta, which has kind of screwed us actually, was that when they want to move as a political formation, they can actually move as a political formation, right? Then that can actually happen. And then like, okay, we're all shifting. We're kind of so aware and kind of concerned about our elders, and these guys are trying to kill us. Okay, we're just going to vote for the other person, and then it just happens, right?
Right. But then the crisis is over. Then you have to deal with a Democrat trifecta.
Yeah. And then you have to deal with the Democrat trifecta, and they're almost like, I like to describe them as like, really interested in losing in a state where they probably should.
No, Michigan is one of those states where I'm just always like, this shouldn't be that hard. Yeah. Like, Michigan should not be hard. Like, it shouldn't be harder than, say, Georgia, for Democrats to win. Although, you speak about the memory. I think one of the things I will give any traumatized people, Palestinians, Jews, Indigenous Americans, etc., are Indigenous peoples. They may not want to be Americans. I'm going to give them that benefit of the doubt. It's fine for you, but you can't forgive me for everybody. So, like...
That's true. I shouldn't do that.
like, there might be some Sioux guy out there who's like, fuck that Varn guy. I accept that. But my point on that is, like, we are seeing these coalitions change so fast. The people who have who tend to be shut out tend to have a longer institutional memory than everybody else. Because, like, for example, you know, I point this out in the case of the South. Like, people assume that the South has always been super conservative, and in some ways it has. But, like, the whole fucking Southern strategy wasn't achieved until 2001 or 2002 in some states, and it's barely stuck. Like Louisiana, Georgia, the Virginias, like they're kind of always like they're kind of in play, and it's only when, like, you know, some weird progressive coalitions like, well, we can ignore those guys, that come and where they fall out of play. And I'm not saying this because to me it's like, well, there's a fundamental misleadingness if you think the partisan affiliation of a state actually tells you about its character. Georgia's still kind of fucked up. Michigan, you know, you live in Michigan. My partner's family's from Michigan. Actually, I have a great number of friends from Michigan because in the reverse Great Migration, which started with black people but ended with white people, there was a shit ton of Michiganders who came to Georgia and then, like, got screwed there too, because once they moved to the South, our economy collapsed in the Great Recession and never returned. But nonetheless, like, you know, like, as I said, Michigan, a very pretty state, which basically exports people in tears. It's interesting to me that people who come from these more marginalized communities, like the black community, like in the South, like, you know, I complain about old college-educated black women in their 70s being super conservative all the time, because they are. They're just Democrats. But, and not everybody, obviously. But at the same time, they do have a long institutional memory, and that's one of the reasons why they don't tend to jump on the progressive trains, because they're like, how many times have we seen you say this, and how many times have you delivered on it? I've been around since the 60s, and my weird, vaguely conservative political machine not just has survived, but actually took over part of the Dixiecrat machine, whereas you have literally never delivered anything to us. And you know what? That's a fair fucking argument. And if you don't have a long memory, you can't construct a longue durée answer to that. Like, either in terms of policy or in terms of even the argument.
Or basic organizing.
Right, yeah. Like, how do you go into those communities and whatnot? Like, you know, my favorite one is if you're in the South in your church-averse, and you want to get to the black community, good luck. Like,
not even like, I mean, that South goes all the way up to the Mason-Dixon. I mean, I used to do a lot of faith and action stuff in Baltimore and Maryland.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, really above it too, because also, like, West Virginia is not on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line, but, you know, you wouldn't know it. Or in Pennsylvania, or what? I'm like, and I'm like, 50% of all people under 40 are not religious, but, like, that's actually not true for some of these subgroups. And also, you do have to pull on elders to get stuff done. I know, like, we would all like to believe that some of us didn't internalize the whole, like, you left, only young people good thing. But like, if you actually want to move a community as to get temporary activists, which are two different things, you got to focus on multiple generations at once that reinforce each other. Or, you know, if all you care about is, like, activist grunt labor, focus on college students, who cares? But you're not going to build anything permanent with that. And which, traditionally speaking, was the conservatives' like structural organizational advantage over us. It's no longer, for reasons that I don't quite understand. You know, something about the last 15 years has also broke their brains. So leftists, pat yourself on the back. You're not the only people who've gone crazy. But because it does seem like conservatives no longer seem as interested in building long-term generational chains and parent institutions that aren't just trolling, or rentier or rent-seeking machines, but they used to. And so it's a thing to look at in this in this scenario. And I think it's also going to be something where, like, you know, for all of my stuff on like working class autonomy and whatnot, this is another place where I think Colin's actually somewhat helpful. Is if you're not actively thinking about this will still fall through the cracks. Like, because just organizing labor, even if it's black and brown labor, does not lead you to like thinking at all about Indigenous issues, because they're kind of,
or even like provisioning children issues. I know. I mean, I listened to the Jules conversation, and it's just like, you know, at the end of the day, like that's kind of it, right? Like,
so if you can't provision children, you're fucked. Like, you just don't like. I hate to say this, but this is one of my fundamental problems with left-wing culture right now. Is I'm like, you win the youth, but you don't have any way to sustain yourself with kids in the long run, because like you really don't even think about family policy at all, except in how oppressive it is. Which means,
yeah,
you know, and like I get a lot of a lot of our critiques of the modern standard notions of family, absolutely fair. Indigenous people will back you up on how fucked up they are. They're not going to back you up, however, not replacing them with some form of kinship.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to think about that. And I think about that all the time. Like, we don't think about provisioning children. We don't think about provisioning. We kind of think about provisioning childcare, but even when we do, it's like from this weird, like, works perspective. Like, we need to provision care labor so that more people can go to work, so that we can provision care labor so more people can go to work, as part of the service consumer economy, I guess. And I'm like, yeah, that's a very weird way to think about this. Like,
I mean, what's kind of sad about this is this, it kind of, so we talked about the 19th century a little bit and kind of the funny kind of divide on it. And I've talked about this before, but like, I kind of just like miss the capacity for imagination that some like abolitionists, progressive reformer had in the like late 19th century, where they were like, how about if we build a school and we actually just bring all these Indigenous children here and completely cut ties with their families, and we could, you know, cut their, like, let's just change, I think there was an ability to imagine like how many generations does it take to change a society. Right. They were also very cognizant of the need to change property relationships with that alongside that as well. Right. So like severalty in boarding schools happened at the same time. I talk about this a lot, but I think it's an important connection. And I don't think anyone's like kind of has like I think there's a squeamishness against it, or this kind of like anxiety around it. It's like, okay, like how much time, like how many generations, like could I like maybe move a situation where I could like start transitioning the children into a different type of society, toward different types of kinship, and then also transitioning them towards like different types of property relationships. I mean, sure, like that's maybe like outside of the box, but like if that's not on the radar, then I don't know like what you understand as like, or, you know, as someone who kind of comes like what you understand as like the inevitability of climate change is that those things are just going to happen, right? If you, regardless probably of most where anyone is, you're going to either be personally displaced or someone's going to be displaced into your landscape, right?
Yeah, this is one of the dark ironies of the Israeli-Palestine situation that I sometimes bring up to like really point out like what you have to think. And I'm like, okay, let's say we settle this, we get a two-state solution, or even better, a binational one-state solution. Not going to happen, but if it did, you know, great. UN peacekeeper force, we settle that in 100 years, everybody stops hating each other, and then the Levant is uninhabitable. Like, you know, and they're like, what? I'm like, well, I want you to look at climate change projections.
Yeah.
Like, so, you know, I just, if your idea of indigeneity is like blood and soil nationalism, and I believe like this is I have my one swipe at common. Give my third point. You have to look at land. You cannot not look at land. But I'm going to point out that, like, you know, some of these indigenous communities, unless we have a miracle happen, are on non-viable land now. Like, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to handle the great movements of peoples without just being like, oh yeah, we're going to let 1 million brown people die at the U.S. border? That'll be great. And you know, are even more likely Europe's border, because as much as Europe is progressive, it's not on that, never has been. So it's something that I think we really have to rethink in this fundamental way, because on one hand, we do have to look at the land. And for the other hand, we're going to have to say, like, there's going to be traumatic cuts in the land for everybody.
Yeah.
How do we reconceive this? This is a point where we can, like, it's not likely, but it is a point where we can. And that's when I start thinking about, like, how radical can you think? Because you're right. Like the residential school system is objectively horrible, but you know what it realized? It realized that if you disconnect kinship relations, you can rewrite the script. Yeah. Now, the reverse of that's also true. If you empower kinship relations, you can also rewrite the script, but you have to be radical enough to do that, as opposed to like, well, that's something that we can't touch. We're going to leave that to market relations. Great. Thanks. like, way to go. Because, I hate to tell you guys, but they're doing a pretty good job of abolishing the family and not replacing it with anything. Great job.
Yeah. So again, like, I think we started with pricing, right, on these kind of different schemes, right? And I think that there is, like, both like a tactical need or a kind of strategic need to kind of approach these things, but kind of like a more deeper philosophical thing, right? Is like, for anyone listening, especially in the US, where they're kind of really, the Biden administration is pushing this forward, right? Of doing accounting on national wealth. There's going to be the kind of deeper penetration of these pricing schemes going into how you're managed, like your landscapes are managed, and this isn't a kind of like appropriate indigeneity, but of this kind of question of like, how much does it cost? How much do you want it to cost, and how much are you willing to pay to provision for your children? And I think when we kind of want to imagine extending kinship to non-humans, even non-organic entities, is like, how much do you want to provision for like the continuation or the replication of healthy air?
Yeah.
Right. The provision for the replication of like necessary like flora and fauna species.
Right.
And
do you want something other than cows and dogs in your future?
And I think, again, like, I think that's actually, I don't want to say like popular, but like I could imagine, right, the if you can put that question to people, not as like a green 2.0, but of like this question of like, hey, like, taxes and the pricing of your environment are really important, but no one seems to really be asking you about that.
Yeah, how do you have input in it? What would it mean for you to have input in it? Like, how do we deal with these? The other thing that you appropriately point out is, how do we deal with these like offsets and stuff, both within nations and between them? And my great thing is, like, I'm not sure these nations survive the next 100 years the way that they currently are. I mean, that's assuming we do, but let's not take the. I sometimes think the human race dies out as the cop out of dealing with all these problems.
Yeah.
So let's assume we don't. And then say, like, well, what happens when all these political arrangements that you currently see really don't survive the stress test of modernity? Because most of them actually aren't even that old. Yeah. Like, so, and you were talking about this, and I'm like, yeah, they can't price for carbon, but they can barely price for the fact they're not even sure the national entities they're talking about are going to exist in 100 years.
Yeah.
Like, and if we look at the historical examples, they likely won't.
Yeah.
So it's very hard. There's a freezing of the moment in this, where I actually do think switching over to, a more relational framework actually does get you to see that, like, oh no, this stuff is shifting, but the relations are going to be there. The nature of those relations may change.
Yeah.
And if you think about your relationship, even our normal language kind of betrays this, to the natural world, you start looking at, like, okay, this is going to be a shifting thing that we have to think about in different terms, because trying to treat them as static ahistorical price things that only price markers can intervene in with discrete atomic, actors. That doesn't seem to be a viable way of thinking about the world. It doesn't seem to generate any sort of ethic or subject that could be useful for maintaining this. and it concedes. I mean, it is kind of interesting to think about. I guess this will be my last point, and then I'll let you have the finishing remarks. But like, I have thought a lot about the irony of like the same people who like 10, 15 years ago said we can't price air, we can't price order. That is beyond pricing as a commodity, are now the people who are like, we got to price it so that people will save it. Yeah. And I'm like, have you conceded too much already? I mean, I know why you get it. Look, I know why you're doing it, because if you don't do something, you've done nothing. And like, we live in this framework, but if this is the horizontal limit of your framework, I feel like we're still stuck, and we're still, in all the contradictions we talked about in the beginning. Like, whereas, like, you talk about like land forward and getting this, like, what is the larger vision for this? In the context of your community, but also in the context of how you relate to other communities. And that's a question that's going to have to be answered. And you can either answer it as a community ahead of time, which you might not be able to perfectly live through, but at least you have a plan, or you can answer it stochastically as stuff is forced upon you. Yeah. And, there are actually some advantages to the latter approach, but they tend to like favor the status quo, actually. So it's, it's very hard for me to like be all prescriptive about this, but it does seem to me that's where a lot of these things lead to. Closing remarks, Malu?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think with that point, right, I'm actually not against the pricing of this stuff, in the sense that like it's here, like I think it's a viable, immediate, like near-term way to like get money to people to do good shit that like take care of their land or whatever. Again, I think that the question that I've been stressing to people is like, where are you in that valuation? Like, and like, yeah, you're not a nuclear state, but like, can you try to intervene in what that pricing is? And like, how is that actually the more important thing? Than like, are we able to price like cultural identity? I would rather be able to price air more powerfully than have my culture priced appropriately. I know that sounds kind of messed up, but like, that's kind of my math on this. And then, but on the flip side, like,
I'm sorry, what was that? Well, I mean, you gotta breathe even to do.
Yeah, culture. Exactly. But I mean, I think that's again, like, that's like weird to people, right? And I think, but again, but then again, also at the other point, right? Like, I think so, yeah. Anyways, like this approach to pricing, this approach to the carbon credits and all this other stuff is kind of a the holding period is not longer than I think the actual life of the holding period would be required to be longer for these credits than these nations may actually exist. And I think to the question that you had about like, how does my community, so I'll answer not for my community, but in like what I'm understanding. In the near term, right? Like in the next 12 months, I might be more than partially responsible for managing 56,000 acres of land, providing water utility to a large portion of that population, and dealing with the fact that with the acquisition of those lands and hopefully putting it into collective management, that there is some sort of economic return for people, right? So that they're not, because just as much as those people have like high kinship and high subsistence, they're also mostly poor. So like, I'm trying to think through how long can I get money to like, how, like, I mean, this is like, I'll try to, and because this is me like existing in this and trying to think through this, is like, we need a better hospital. We need better roads. We need better infrastructure. But I also don't want to completely ruin our relationships. Are there other international, indigenous, non-indigenous communities that are also trying to do the same thing? And luckily, I've been able to connect to those and develop relationships that allow us to coordinate. And then in the near term, right, or not in the near term, but like in like the more kind of state proximity, right, of like Hawaii, like my imagination is never that this is like a place for Hawaiians. I want to be very clear that this is like a Hawaiian only context, right? But that this will provide a model for people to approach these issues of property relationships, these issues of like environmental degradation on their own terms, right? And then I do think that if you can give people that, if you can put that question in front of people's faces, if you can actually give that to them, then you do have at least the opportunity for cooperation in ways, and like diverse cooperation.
Yeah.
And like you said, like I could just let the status quo happen. I could just kind of let these impositions happen. But also, like you said, it's probably not going to work out well for like an island community. And for anyone out there who's like, this, you require like a military imposition or some sort of like forceful imposition of these kind of climate change initiatives. Yeah, then like, yeah, like you can just let that happen. You kind of have to equate where you exist in that continuum. But like, I don't think that there's any like harm. How do I say this? I would rather be prepared to negotiate with that imposition than not. And I do think I'm putting myself and my family, where I'm moving my kid there, to be in the best position. And like, honestly, like, sorry, this has been a long kind of meandering last statement, but like, I know this sounds insane, but like, I do think my kid has a better chance of living and maybe like a better quality of provisioning in a community that will teach him how to hunt and fish.
Yeah.
Like, and I know it sounds kind of like menial or kind of like small, but like at the end of the day, it's kind of like why I'm doing this. And I think like people should be trying to understand that, of like what's going to put your children, your future, the communities that you care about in a better position.
Yeah. I read that John Michael Greer piece, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable when I was like, well, you know, I don't agree with most of his framework, and I think a lot of this is silly. But two things he's right about. You don't learn to be a subsistence farmer from being a community gardener.
Yeah.
As a community gardener, I can tell you that. And number two, like, yeah, you need to be in communities that have somewhat resilient attitudes towards nature, or towards being able to pivot in urban planning very quickly. And the one thing I can tell you right now that is not common in the United States is that, and weirdly, it does lead me often to sound like I am both the like Marxist revolutionary, also conservative prepper.
Yeah.
Where, you know, like I'm a vegetarian, but like you should know how to, in a worst case scenario, slaughter meat and store it in lard. Like,
well, why not?
Like, you know, well, I mean, it's just like, and I'm not just saying that because I know how to, but like, it's just something that's like, it's a useful skill to have if you need to keep a community alive in a worst case scenario. Do I think that we're all in that scenario? No, but it's no longer out of the realm of possibility for me. It's like when I talk about like, you know, our elite failure, and I'm like, you know, it's no longer in the realm of possibility that the United States in 10 years is under a military junta that actually didn't even come from Trump. Like, it's not, it is not even out of the realm of possibility anymore. In a way that, like, if I'd have said that to myself 20 years ago, I would have said, to me, I'd lost my fucking mind. Like, whereas today I'm like, well, you know, that's a small chance. I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but it's an outcome possibility that's no longer non-zero, and that is weird. And I do think we have to think about this. And I also think, like, in general, like you were talking about this provisioning community, we need to think about building more resilient communities as is, because the one thing I will say about the culture of the left, we are fragile community builders. Yeah. Like, even comparatively to conservatives, who are also pretty fragile, not gonna lie. They're kind of
and getting more fragile.
Yeah, I mean, but what's weird is they're just becoming more like us.
Yeah.
And people are like, how dare, but I'm like, no, for real. Like, they live in enclosed ecosystems without resilient communities of which they are responsible. And so do we. You know, I think about that all the time because I have been in scenarios where, like, I mentioned this, but like, where like Muslim Brotherhood people who didn't know who I was, like, hid me from a mob and a police, you know, that was responding to a police riot, you know, and like, I'm really grateful to them. And also, like, that required strong community bonds that even would protect an outsider, because, you know, as an outsider in the community, I'm owed hospitality. Like, and when I talk about that, like, there are some things about conservative communities that maybe we shouldn't abandon. You know, so it's those tensions, and I'm with you on like, yeah, I mean, if our inner city Detroit or wherever, I mean, I love Detroit, don't get me wrong, I think Detroit hatred's overstated, but like, or someplace where you can learn to live off the land, well, you might have to live off the land. I mean, like, this is just a reality. And civilizations have fallen before. So it's just a thing. I mean, that's kind of a wild way to end this. So maybe I'll end on a slightly less wild set of speculation. But I mean, like, for me, one of the most damaging things about where the left has gone in the past 20 years is its total dependency on institutions and things that it does not control. And I don't just mean these pricing schemes, but I also mean like, even like UBI, like you don't really control the monetary policy and whatnot. Like, come on, the more you do that off of just like, well, they should be nicer to us, the more I'm like, you are ceding yourself to a relationship of dependency. And I do think, to get back to when we were talking about why there's some maybe a little bit of a special kind of conservatism in parts of the indigenous community, is like, well, look at what they could easily say. Look at what being a dependent does. Yeah, I can't get a pothole fixed without an act of Congress or plumbing done. Which, by the way,
it's very stark for them. It's very clear how being a domestic dependent, which is not entirely different than anyone else's relationship. It's just kind of different to the like government, but it's really stark. And again, like, I actually don't think it's like that far-fetched or that wild, because I'm not so much concerned with like the collapse of society. I just think people should like try to imagine their ecosystem as a possible ally. Just give that a shot. Please just give that a shot. I mean, and like, what does that entail? Because I think,
Malu, I was talking to someone the other day about like, how would we design cities that would actually more like, we need super dense housing. Sure, fine, agree. How do we make it more conducive for other forms of animal life? Like, and like, you're talking about thinking big. Like, that's a thinking big. Like we need to think about that, because I don't even think. What's funny is, I don't even think it would be as hard as people think it would be. It's like,
we got here, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, but like the biggest realization for me, and I brought this up now for 10 years, which is living in rural Korea with skyscrapers and going like, oh, they're maintaining the land for like community and or agricultural use, and so they're not wasting it on single person homes because they're on a fucking peninsula that's been cut off by the north, so like they don't have a choice. It's basically an island. But like, this necessity actually gives you a model for rethinking all of this, because it's not like people are hunkering down for land space in this, because there's literally communal, even though it's like subdivision communal, that's not that great, but literally communal public and land spaces. Like, and I personally found it to be a much more fulfilling way of life. Like, than me having to have a yard to keep my dog and then like figuring all this other shit out. Whereas there, it's like, you know, I have this tract of land that's everyone in here, and then I have this little shop over here, and like I can even go to the shop when we're flooded out and the public services are shit, and like I can eat, and my neighbors more or less know me. I mean, Korea is a little bit more anonymous than Mexico or even Cairo. Cairo was an interesting lesson of like a city of 4 billion, million people. That would be crazy. 4 billion. But a city of 4 million people could actually have fairly tight knit local communities.
Oh yeah.
Like it was a like, hey, you can't just blame this on urbanization, people. Yeah. Like, because like everyone on my street, even though I didn't know them, they all knew who I was, and because I was an outsider, but also like there was this relationship of hospitality that was expected into it, and I was fairly protected from it, and like it's something you need to model, and I just think like most leftist organizational thinking right now doesn't think that way. Like they'll occasionally start talking about like neighborhood organizing, but I don't know really what they mean by that. Or they'll talk about tenants unions, which I of course support.
Yeah.
But I'm like, but you need this whole other like community infrastructure that honestly, like Al Akalinsky at community organizing doesn't provide you. Like, so you're gonna have to rethink that. And I think interestingly, when I talked, this is where I'm on the, like, hey, learn from the people who are in the most extreme forms of this situation. Is like indigenous people in the United States, for the most part, by necessity, not kind of any special like indigenous magic, like have had to think about this in a different way, and they're like the traumas of like us post-Europeans being forced into modernity are mostly 600 years ago or more. Like unless maybe you're an Italian or German and it's 200 years ago. But like but the problems for indigenous people is like yesterday, literally. So like and in some places more than others, like when I think about like the liberalization of say Guatemala. It's
totally.
It's an active, real, ongoing. We see it right now. You can go and look what this looks like in its ugliness together. And I think that's something we have to think about. And the other thing I want to end off on supporting you on is I don't blame people for taking these pricing regimes either, any more than I blame anyone who has to use the state to do anything. Like you exist in this framework. You got to survive in this framework. You have to use this framework. My question for you is, can you start thinking about what happens when this framework gets strained, stretched, or dissolved? Because that should be how you interact with this. Like, yes, I can use this now, but how do I build power that doesn't make me a dependent? And would be able to deal with massive shifts in national, international, and local politics just completely changing.
Other market
other market or whatever. Like, because what I see in the United States is, and in Canada too, to a lesser degree Mexico, is this assumption that our political forms are just frozen and for good or ill, and we just have to accept that as everything like completely falls a fucking apart. And I'm like, but all this is relatively, like, some of this is extremely recent. And all of this pretty much, none of it goes back before the like literally most of the institutions that we take for granted are not older than the baby boomers. It's something to really think about. Like, so there's going to be some massive shifts, and we're already seeing it. Like, so I think that's for people like, oh, that was meandering. I'm like, yeah, it's a big topic. I get it. But like, I guess my takeaways is we have to deal with the system that we're given, but we should also admit the contradictions that the system has and not lie to ourselves about it, so that we can use it to push for a different set of relations and systems. And that may have to involve an even broader rethinking than just capitalism versus socialism. What do we want this socialism to actually look like? And that latter question seems to be like a big one that, for a lot of people, socialism is just what we have now, but stuff is free. And I don't think that's what we're going to get at all. Like, I don't even think I want it, like, frankly. Like,
so, again, like, and I don't want to take too much more time, but like, I think like for people to understand like the context of how I approach this stuff, it's like, I take very seriously the fact that like I might have, if I take on this land and I take on these credits, these funds to do forest restoration, give people jobs, I have like a generation to get off of that arrangement. I have like maybe 30 years, maybe 40 years before that arrangement affects the relationships that are there, that are actually sustaining people in ways that capital can't and doesn't. And I think people just need to take very seriously kind of when they make these kind of arrangements or engage in these systems, particularly this new one that's going to be affecting all of us, is like, are you even planning to what to transition from? And I think this is like the thing for me is like, how are you establishing alternative arrangement that will actually allow you to transition, right? And again, I think that the allyship, the arrangement, the provisioning with the ecosystem does allow you to ask this question of like, how much more of my time can I spend up with non-wage subsistence or some other kind of communal activity that allows for these things to not buy up so much of my time, so much of my power. And that's like something that's I think everyone's going to be facing and should be facing kind of right now. Because I think like when it starts hitting the fan, you get about 20 to 30 years, maybe 40, and then things shift too hard.
Yeah, they're at risk of going even longer. But I always have warned people like, look, we've seen what happened when revolutionary subjects happen at maximal social entropy. They perpetuate the social entropy for a few years, then they stop and stabilize, but usually they've exhausted their subject to the point that they can't maintain their politics and they collapse in 2 to 3 generations. I don't know where we've seen that before, but you know, like, so you don't want to wait to that point. This is my whole thing with accelerationists, for example. Like, okay, you want the contradictions to heighten to the point where everything falls apart, and you just think the left is gonna be able to deal with the trauma of society breaking down. Like, I can literally think of twice in the history of ever where that went our way. And even then, it was only temporarily, ultimately, because those societies don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
So, like, this is, like, that's to me a crazy thing. Yeah, I do think right now is the moment where you actually could dream big. And I worry that we're not. We're just not. Like, we're just, you know, we see the pricing, we see the carbon credits, we see we see the Green New Deal, and we just go, okay, that's it. There we go. And we're done. And I'm just like, no, I don't think we can stop there. And I don't think, if that makes me an ultra or weird right deviationist obsessed with primitive forms, whatever, I don't give a shit.
I want a TV, y'all.
Yeah, like, well, this is the thing. Like, I'm like, I clearly do a podcast on the internet. My God. You know, and that's even though I don't think, like, I'm always harping on about how people don't even figure in the internet cost because they don't really see where the energy's coming from. But like, come on, I just want us. I don't want to get rid of our technology. I want us to rethink our, like, the way we're using it, our relationship to it, and our relationship to nature. And this is where, you know, you were talking about my hermeneutics in the eco-socialist, and I have my things like, they accept human exceptionalism again because they did it in the 19th century. Damn it. Or, they reject this form of value theory and they're not. But one of the things I do think that they are correctish about is we have to really start radically rethinking our metabolic relationship. And I realize that's a metaphor, but to the larger society. And it would be great if that was done by the people most affected by it, the proletariat, and then other peoples like, you know, the colonized, etc., the indigenous, etc. That would be way better. But frankly, at this point, I'm worried that we're so stuck in our ways in the United States that we're going to miss a transition that is possible because while U.S. imperial power is declining, true, you don't going to get a push from me on that. This is still Fortress North America.
Oh, yeah.
In a very real sense. And the only reason we can't do anything in that context is for some reason, since we're not the universal hegemon anymore, which we only really were for like 16 years anyway. We've lost our fucking minds, but it's not because we don't have the material emphasis to do anything about it. And this is also where, I guess, to give Colin a 5th point today. He's gotten a lot. I only got one question on him.
I can't wait for the comments on this one.
There is a sense in which if we try to reduce this all to like simple, like vulgar materialism, you have a hard time explaining what's happening in the United States because from a vulgar materialist perspective, we're actually doing okay. Yet we seem like we've lost our damn mind, and that that element of the United States right now is like, we have to get a hold on that. We have to get a hold of ourselves. But I don't like, do I expect our quote elites to be able to do that shit right now? Have you seen them lately? Like I literally would trust most college dropout, or not even college dropouts. I trust most high school dropouts who've had to maintain a job for more than 2 years, more than I would trust the average policy advisor right now. Like, and that's actually a new thing for me. That is not my default orientation.
Right.
So it's something to think about when we think about who's pricing this shit, because who's pricing this shit are the people that I would replace with high school dropouts who like run Ubers, because I trust them more on the pricing than I fucking do like you know, somebody who interned at Goldman Sachs and has an Ivy League degree and, you know, has the right liberal pedigrees right now, because something is wrong in that world. Like, well, and on that note, thank you, Malu, for coming on, even though,
of course,
not to come up with people to shit on people with graduate degrees who do activist work, but because
it's okay.
Well, I mean, that also applies to me. Like,
that's true. That's true. I'm a very bad doctoral candidate.
Who in any sense isn't?
That's true.
I am not a doctoral candidate. I copped out and got the MFA, so you know what? Like, I have a terminal degree that doesn't matter. So, like, I mean, you know, unless you think you need a terminal degree to be a fucking poet.
That's actually my wife.
Oh, well,
she got her MFA from Irvine in poetry. I don't know why I never brought that up anyways, but that's a whole conversation.
That's funny. I am proof of what that does to people. Just
no, she wants to be a midwife. She wants to be a midwife now, so you can kind of see how.
Yeah, I became a teacher. Everybody eventually, like, we got to write about something, and that usually involves getting a real job.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you so much, Malu, for coming on.
Yeah, of course. Take care.
Take care.